Thank you. So how do we begin to connect our story, the story I've tried to tell about our being made in the image of God and called to be like him in all our ways, in our bodily life, in our relationships? How do we connect that story with our culture? Well, I think first I just want to say we need to connect it with ourselves first before we rush out to what we say. This story needs to come from our own hearts, from our own conviction. It needs to be told to one another. It needs to be told in stories. It needs to be imaged in flesh and blood, in real lives. We need to see it at work. We need to live it out. We need to show it as well as tell it. That'll be worth 1,000 words sometimes, because, of course, sometimes in this area, people say, I can't hear what you're saying because of what I see. And what I see is that you can't wait to get onto the hot button issues, transgender and same-sex attraction. But we keep under wraps the pornography that's going on in our hearts in here. So we're keen to talk about them out there, but we keep that, or our own loose attitudes to marriage, or premarital sex that's part of the life of many Christian churches, including evangelical churches, and an easy divorce culture. We give ourselves a big get-out-of-jail-free card at times, our culture feels, and we can't wait to talk about the gays out there. Well, we need it. If you notice, we've had a whole session on the sexuality, and we haven't talked about same-sex attraction in any detail, or trans. We haven't talked about those hot-button issues, because those hot-button issues are the downstream outworkings of upstream issues that we compromised on long ago. And so it isn't about them, the gays and the transgender out there. It's about us in here, this story. And it's about how we not only tell it to one another again, but we live it. And if the sexual revolution is forcing us to rethink how we do this, then we should be grateful. So how do we begin to connect? Well, what I suggest is that you do it authentically. You just say what your story is. And the way I do that is with 3 words. I'd start with sorry, thank you, and then I'd say please. Let's unpack each of those. I think I'd be prepared to say sorry. To somebody, I'd say, sorry, I think we let you down. I let you down. Our gospel promises freedom and flourishing. And in this big area of sex and relationships, we promised big, but we offered silence and shame very often. We didn't tolerate the gays out there, but we tolerated a lot of other things in here. We've taken a hard line on people who don't fit our rules and shown endless patience and understanding with some of our own struggles over divorce. And sometimes we have been bigoted and quick to condemn, and we need to say sorry. We let you down. We have a gospel which promises life. I've come that they may have life, Jesus said, and we excluded this big part of our lives from that promise. And we're sorry. And I don't honestly think I don't feel bigoted in my own heart. One of my ministers is gay. He wouldn't use that term as an identity, but sometimes he'll use it as an adjective to describe him. Ed Shaw, written his wonderful book, The Plausibility Problem. He is a gift to our congregation, because Ed, in being open about his sexuality, challenges us not to all be out there telling our stories, as Ed's prepared to do, but to be a bit more real about some of the questions that we struggle with. And I just feel Ed is a great friend. I feel he's a gift. It's not a problem, as he seeks to order his sexual desires with God's calling. And it's tough, and I see that, and I love Ed, and I feel bigoted toward him. What a privilege. He's a gift. So I don't feel bigoted, but I do need to recognize when I see some of the things some Christians write and say, and I hear it, and if someone says to me, well, you should hear what I hear, and I say, did that, what I've been on the receiving end of, I'd say, well, did that person say they were a Christian? And they say, yes. And I say, well, I'm a Christian. And if they said that, I won't say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry they said that, because it is a violation of the gospel and the way of Christ, and it is not Christian. So we are bigoted sometimes, we have been, and we need to own that. And I'm not into big apologies, the church issuing any kinds of apologies. I think if you start that, we'll be apologizing for everything in church history. Where will you stop some of the things in church history? Now, I'm not into those, but I am at a personal level into saying, just be honest. We got some of this stuff wrong. We're not perfect. The world doesn't need us to pretend that we are. So be authentic. We're sorry, got some of this wrong. And then, thank you. Thank you too. Thank you for waking us up, shaking us out of our complacency. Thank you for refusing to let this go away and be brushed under the carpet. Thank you for forcing us to ask not just what we're against, but what are we for? Thank you, because this is important. We need to think about it. And then finally, having connected in that way, please can we have a conversation about these big issues? And then we've got the problem is, how do we connect these big issues with where they're at? Don't we? And I think we were, Scott, isn't it? Scott, yes. We were saying earlier, it's thrilling to think about the beauty of God and our being made in his image. It's gobbledygook when you're trying to explain it over a half pint down in a local pub to someone. There's a big gap between their reality and our reality. Now, how do we make that connection? And I think we can get some hints about this from the Apostle Paul. And if you remember in Acts 17, we read that when he arrived in Athens, he found when Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see the city was full of idols. He was distressed. He was upset. He was exercised by that. And we read that he went around looking at the idols. He must have been writing Romans 1 in his head as he did that. What did he write? Romans 1. For although they knew God, verse 21, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. He might have said, and they heard the voice of Satan, you shall be as gods. And they ended up worshipping them, idols. Claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images to look like mortal human being and birds. And he was greatly distressed. And he was incubating Romans 1 in his mind. And they're very interested in the Athenians, and they take him and they put him up on the Areopagus and say, right now, tell us what you're saying. We're all ears. And what does he do at that point? Does he give them Romans 1? Does he condemn them? Does he expose their idolatry and link it with their guilt and God's judgment? Is that how he opens? Is that how he connects? Is that how he builds a bridge to where they're at? He was greatly disturbed by this. And you feel this in Romans 1 as he sees the desecration of the image of God in man, as we prostrate ourselves before things, the glory of the image of God being demeaned in this way. So does he get up there and let them have it? Idolaters. What does he say? Then Paul stood up in the meeting and he said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious." What's he doing there? He's connecting with their spiritual longings. I see that you're worshippers. I see that you're lovers. You want to bow down. I see that. And I'm like that as well. And as I walked around, I was really interested to see what you were worshipping. Then I came across this altar to the unknown God, and it is he of who I wish to speak just now. Can I have a hearing? Now, do you see what he's done? He's connected with where they're coming from, and he will lead them to his call for repentance later in his sermon. But initially, he doesn't try to answer questions nobody's asking. And that's our problem sometimes. We answer questions no one's asking. So what do we do here? How do we begin to connect? I'd suggest that we say, what are people wanting? They're wanting freedom and flourishing and fairness, because even the image of God, spoiled and corrupted, still has this instinct for fairness. You see it in children. One of the developmental hallmarks of childhood is children, they're very fair. He's got it now, he's had it now, it's my turn now. It's inbuilt into us, an instinct for fairness, because we're made in the image of likeness of God. A God who cares about little people, who cares about injustice, you see. So when our culture wants freedom, flourishing, fairness, we sort of say they're onto something about their humanity. And what I'd suggest that we do is we say, can we have a conversation about that? Because we share those longings. That's what we want too. Do you think we want freedom? We're just like you. We want flourishing. We want fairness. Our God, his heart burns against injustice. That's our story. No, we want those things. But where we differ is we have a very different story about how you get there. Please, can we share that with you? And maybe they're like the rich young ruler, they'll walk away. Maybe they just won't get it. That is the burden of being gospel proclaimers. People don't want to hear, but that's how we approach them. Can we share with you our story about how God loves us? And we can connect with each of those headings, really. So, freedom. We want freedom. Now, you've acknowledged that, you've said, look, I'm sorry, we promised big. We didn't deliver. Now it's your turn. You say, so in this conversation, you've promised freedom. That's what Hugh Hefner promised, freedom. How's that working out? What's happened? Has expressive individualism, looking within inside yourself for meaning, identity, has it delivered the freedoms it's promised? Friends, the emperor has no clothes. There's no evidence that disorders linked to identity, such as self-harm or some forms of eating disorder or what we call borderline disorder, and there's no evidence that these mental health issues are going away because we've learned to look inside ourselves. Self-harm is on the increase. Now, I'm not, because I'm an epidemiologist, I'm an academic, I'm not saying I can prove a causal link, but I can tell you that this revolution, there's no evidence it's producing the freedoms in human identity that's promised. What it's doing, it's burdening us with a personal project of endless self-making, open-ended, ungrounded, everyday, who am I now? And it says, look inside yourself. And I don't know about you, but I'd say in my story, when I look inside myself, I'm a grumpy old man one day, and I'm a frightened old man another, and I'm quite a kind of a zippy, let's go for it man the next day, and then I'm running around with my grandkids the next day, and I'm very academic the next. And I look inside, I see lots of things inside myself. I see shifting sands of insecurity, doubt, and I see sin. And that's my story. Now, I know that isn't your story, we say to our culture when you look inside, or is it? But that's my story. I found sin, and I found some tough stuff, and some greed, and some aggression. And I don't know, are you saying I build my house on those shifting sands? Because if you are, I was nearly taken in for a minute. I was nearly taken in. So, in our vision, you see, freedom isn't found in endless self-making. For us, freedom's found in learning to be God's creature all over again. It's not a burden, it's a gift. It's not a prison, it's a release. It's that you don't have to make yourself up every day. You're released into the adventure of working out what it means to be made in the image of God and called to make a difference in his world, to serve his world in your own unique way, his image bearer. And so for us, freedom isn't about fighting our design, it's learning to live in harmony with our design as God's revealed it to us. And you don't have to believe that, but that's our story. But we both want the same thing. Now, what we've done there by connecting with what people want is that we're looking for this common ground, you see. And very often, where we go wrong in our apologetics is that we don't recognize that we're dealing with the wrong answer, but to the right question very often. So the right question is, how are we free? It's a good question. But if we preach a gospel that sounds restricted, it sounds as if we're not worried about freedom. We've got to connect with the desire of the human spirit to be who we are. And we would say in our story, being who you are is the adventure of learning to be God's image and to be made in his image. And that's who we are. So it was quite a good question. We share it. Very different answer. It's called the gospel of Christ. So we connect with freedom. And then there's second, flourishing. Human beings achieving their full potential. And we'd say to our culture, so just in terms of keeping promises, you promise flourishing. Surely our sex lives should be flourishing. Now the brakes are off. Now the straitjacket's out. How's the project going of people being free to be sexual? Here's the irony. We're having less sex now as a society than decades ago. There's something about idols, you know. They always offer more and more, but deliver less and less, until in the end, they have everything, and you have nothing. And if you look at people's sex lives, it's interesting, isn't it? You're all interested now. If you look at people's sex life, how often, in terms of surveys, do people have sex in the population on a sample weighted to be representative of the population? Okay, this is a very simple graph. It's in a book by Professor Spiegelhalter, so it must be correct, mustn't it, with a name like that. He's Professor of Statistics at Oxford. He's written a book called Sex by Numbers, and it's just looking at all the methodological challenges of collecting data and trying to say, well, what seems to be reliable? And this is one of his points, that sexual activity, we've done freedom. For us, freedom is living in harmony with our design. That's our story. That's the way we see it. We've gone on now to flourishing and more and better sex. Well, this is the median, which is a kind of an average frequency of sex in the last month, age 16 to 44. So it's not all oldies like us, 16 to 44. How often are people having sex? Women, this is 1990, and men, they're the same. So let's look at women. 5 times a month in 1990, 4 times a month in 2000, 3 times a month in 2010. Why, says Professor Spiegelhalter, if you extend that graph down, no one will be having any sex at all by the year 2040. Now, he's a statistician, so A, he would never extend a graph down. But B, I doubt very much that's going to be the case. But it's interesting, isn't it? It promised so much more, but there seems to be less. And the same's true on quality of relationships. The army of agony ants, the endless television shows. The more we talk about it, the less satisfying it seems to be. There's no evidence that the quality of people's sex lives is improving at all. In fact, again, the academic in me would say, well, the evidence isn't absolutely clear, but the trend overall is that people are less satisfied now than they were. So they're having less sex, and what sex they have, they're feeling less satisfied with. So how's the project of flourishing going? Well, in this area, not very well. And we just need to be ready to point this up. And it promised big, like we have, delivered small, this revolution. And in our story, this word flourishing, we say we want to flourish. God wants us to achieve our full potential. But in our story, the way you get there isn't self-fulfillment. Friends, it never has been. It is self-sacrifice and self-denial. And that's in God's economy. Just the way God works, that is how we flourish. Less becomes more. It's the genius of the gospel. You deny yourself, you find yourself. It was ever thus. And it's the same in this area of the gospel as in other areas. If any man would deny himself, let him take up his cross. The cross has always been our symbol. And yet today, the thought of somebody being denied something in this entitlement culture, we can barely bring ourselves to express the cross. No, ours is a cross-shaped calling. And you say, well, how can I ask someone who's same-sex attracted? Celibacy? How can you ask that in today's culture? I don't know. The same way as Christians always ask. It's the same way as those Silitan martyrs. How can we ask them to go and be hacked down just for saying, I have to be who I am? How do you ask people to do that? Because we have a cross-shaped faith, which says that the way of the cross is the way to life. And this is where the rubber hits the road of self-denial today. And if this culture is making us sit up and think, yes, probably our faith is going to cost us a little bit after all, then maybe we should be thankful for that, because it's called the gospel. But until we begin to feel this in our own guts, they'll never believe it out there. That for us, self-flourishing is by way of sacrifice, not fulfillment. So freedom, flourishing. And of course you'd say, well, I thought this was a better story. I get this with students, you see. I remember a Dutch student, she said, hang on a minute, you're calling this a better story? None of my friends will think this is a better story, let me tell you. You know, they don't think denying yourself sounds a better story. And that isn't a problem of the sexual revolution. This has always been our problem as Christians. We carry a cross through the street and we say, this is a better story. This is the way to life. And that's the case here too. And I wish it weren't. I wish I could give people what they want. But so it is, and we need to be obedient to our calling at this moment in our history. And then third, fairness. Human instincts for fairness. And we need to recognize, you know, the real desire for fairness out there in many people. They're a lot fairer than some of us. They're more even-handed. Give someone the benefit of the doubt. Wait before jumping. Recognize that in one's conversation partner. But we share that too. Our God's a God of fairness. But I think what we'd want to say is we share the instinct, but we think about fairness in a different way as well. we don't just think about fairness as Christians in terms of my rights. We think about it in terms of my duties, because your right depends on my duty to respect it. The two sides of a coin. And our duties, our calling is big in our story. And that's our story of fairness. And if we're honest, what has the sexual revolution delivered for the most vulnerable in our society? It seems to me that one of the things we have to face is who's paying the price of our adult freedoms? It's our kids. 50% of kids reaching the age of 16 with both parents at home, the other half not. This is an outrage. This isn't a consequences-less phenomenon in our society. It's an outrage that we're doing this to our children. Nearly a half of children born outside of wedlock. This is an outrage in God's economy. It is not as God plans it. Do you know, in one study, over the last 3 decades, the number of children needing to be placed into care, called looked after children, has been steadily increasing, with one analysis suggesting that 1 in 30 children born between 1992 and 1994 became looked after, entered care at some point in their lives. This breaks God's heart. What you've got to remember is if you're a looked after kid, your experience is very likely that you're a little 2-year-old and suddenly there's a new bloke in the house who wasn't here yesterday, and he picks you up and he shakes you and he smiles and he seems to know you and you don't know who he is. And then the next week, there's another bloke here and he's gone, and now he picks you up and jogs you up and down. And your mother seems to be very interested in him, not so interested in you anymore. And he's around for 6 months, but then he's gone. And you're building in your own developmental trajectory notions of what you can trust in life and what you can't, and whether life is trustworthy and isn't. You don't know what you can trust here because now he's gone. And now she's gone, and you're looked after by total strangers. And they're smiling and they seem to know who you are, and they're called foster parents, and they've got a granny and grandpa who are all over you and you don't know who they are. And that lasts for 3 months, and now you're back out of being looked after, and now you're being looked after by somebody else. And what we're doing here, friends, is we're heaping injustice on the most vulnerable members of our society. And our children are paying the price for our adult freedoms. And God gets angry at this with injustice. So for us, kids are important. Do you know there's a book by E.O. Bakker, a theologian, I think he was Norwegian, but it's called When Children Became People, The Rise of Christianity, or something like that. And his thesis is, and I think it's well grounded, is that in the Greco-Roman world, kids were at the bottom of the social hierarchy. You know, kids, just kids. It goes certain orders of men and then women and then slaves and then kids. And expositio was quite legal. You could, if you didn't like your kid, particularly if you didn't like little girl, you leave them out exposed to die or to be picked up, as often happened, and taken into forms of slavery and prostitution. And Christians very quickly, amongst themselves, banned that kind of behavior. And indeed, they seemed to love their kids, and they brought them for forms of baptism and dedication. And they seemed to remember their Savior had said, "Bring the kids to me, because of such is the kingdom of heaven." Do you notice, I think it's very interesting how the disciples' default was Jesus won't want to see kids, he's important. And they'd been infected by Greco-Roman culture that kids don't matter. Jesus says kids do matter. bring them here. The early Christians remembered how God's heart burned against child sacrifice in the Old Testament time. His anger was kindled. God has always had a heart for kids. And what this revolution has done is it's been unfair to the weakest of all. And that bothers us. Or it should do. And so in our story, fairness, let's just try and get this one back. Fairness is about our duties towards our kids, as well as our rights for ourselves. And that means, as a community, because marriage is such a great, two people living together, committed to one another for all of your childhood and beyond. Kids love that. It's ever so simple. They love the stability of marriage. It underscores and underpins their emotional and psychological development wonderfully. And they thrive on it. And so we as Christians, because of our duty to our kids and to one another, we build communities that value strong marriages. Because a strong marriage is the cement that creates a good family. And as a community, those of us who are single know that. And so we say yes to God's call for us to chasten us as our way of supporting marriage, that sex is for marriage and the promises that you take. And we support our families in that way. Because of our duties to one another, we build communities that serve the most vulnerable. And that's how we think about fairness in our story. It's about them. Freedom, flourishing, fairness. Oh, and we may have covered childhood in shame, and we own up to that. This culture's covered it in pornography. The pornogrification of childhood. Is that a big step forward? The Children's Commissioner, the government-appointed body for the welfare of children, published a report 3 years ago. It was called, basically, Porn is Everywhere. And it's a report into the prevalence of pornography in childhood. I remember hearing the Children's Commissioner on radio saying, we don't need to talk statistics, it's everywhere. Porn is everywhere in childhood. And yes, we brought our children into a sense of their awakening sexuality and shame. This culture brings them in pornography and the degradation of women and stylized sex that bears no relation to reality. Is this fair, our kids? We don't think so. So we share this vision of fairness, but for us, fairness is about my duties toward others as well as rights for myself. I ask you to agree with everything I've said, we might say, but that's our story. And so we've rediscovered, I hope, something of our vision of human flourishing. And I know that a lot of you are thinking, okay, well, that sounds all right so far, and you've got lots of questions. So what I wanted to do was set aside as much time for questions, answers, comments as possible so that we can work together a little bit on this. But before I finally finish, I do want to say something about, well, how do we work this story into the reality of our fellowships? Because we need to ready ourselves if we're to be welcoming, biblically inclusive fellowships for some tough pastoral challenges in the very near future, if not already. I was talking to a church planter recently. He said, we've been going 3 years. There are 70 people in my plant. I already have a same-sex couple and a transgender person. And that's out of 70, So we're going to have to, and that's before we even rethink divorce and how we think about divorce amongst ourselves and face up to the pornography in our culture, in our church culture. We've got work to do, friends. Lots of pastoral issues. But what I argue for is we need to create a community of grace. God is a grace-filled God. He's welcoming. He's full of forgiveness. the number of possibilities for fresh starts with him are endless. And that's the culture we have around here. And so what I suggest is that we build church cultures that I call big tent hospitality, biblical inclusiveness, that throw open the doors, say, please come, regardless of your background, your story, your identity, your situation at the moment. And let us serve you, regardless of sexuality, gender, whatever. Let us do what we can to help you because we want to. So they're places of grace, welcome, but they're places of truth. And we say, look, this is our blueprint. This is what we believe God calls us to in his image, to the obedience, to deal with sin and immorality, to be faithful in our marriages, to be chaste in our singleness, to be working at our duties to one another to support strong families. This is our blueprint. But what we can tell you, if, say, you're a gay couple and you've come in here and one of you's converted, or you've brought your child along who's disabled and you've adopted and you love the community here, but you're not sure about the faith bit at the moment, what we want to say is, you are welcome here. Because nobody here quite lives up to this blueprint. We're all on the same page. We're all strugglers to live up to the claim of God, to be in his image. Just don't ask us to give up the blueprint. We won't. It's given by God for the life of the world. And those of us that are called into leadership, you have to be emblems of that blueprint. Those of us who are getting serious in our faith, who make a commitment, you need to take this blueprint seriously because that's what following Christ means. But don't feel that anyone's up here and you're down there. Let us serve you. This is for everybody. Never ask us to give up this blueprint. We never will, because it's life for the world and it's given by God himself. Now, in between those two, truth and grace, there's 1,000 tricky pastoral problems that we're going to have to deal with. And what I strongly want to urge friends is, don't let's fall out over the secondary issues. You know, quite how we deal with some of this. That's when we need to be as grace-filled as we can. Let's stay united over the primary issue of what God's truth is and what he calls us to. But we are going to differ. Some churches are going to say, well, we allow someone to communion at this stage in the repentance, and others. There are going to be some differences there. Let's try and support one another. We've got enough to do in holding firm to God's call and claim in terms of what he's calling us to. So, there are going to be lots of issues. But again, we've not entirely been, never been here before. The Christian missionaries in the 19th century were faced with polygamy. Polygamy has been our greatest challenge, actually, to the Christian sexual ethic. And the huge problem with what do you do with a polygamy? And there was a very good way of dealing with it, I think, a very bad way of dealing with it. And you talk to missionaries who know the history. A very bad way is you say, no, it's one man, one woman. You need to get rid of all your other wives, choose which one's going to be the proper wife, and the rest, they're out. Then you can't do that anymore. And then you have a proper Western wedding with a wedding dress and all the rest of it, you say. Big mistakes, because what people didn't realize was how knitted into the cultural norms and interdependencies that were there was polygamy. Kids were out on the street. Women were destitute. People blundered in, you see, into these existing patterns and caused mayhem sometimes. Now, what the wiser missionaries did, and certainly part of the Anglican Church did this, and you may not agree with this, but I want to put it out as a possibility, was they said, look, we have to be realistic about the interdependencies that are here in terms of this extended family and all the kids that are involved. And so you can be baptized as a follower of Jesus Christ and remain in a polygamous relationship. But at your baptism, you subscribe publicly to the blueprint. You say, this is not of God's design for us. It's part of my act of repentance now to acknowledge where I am. And so you subscribe to the doctrine, but we accommodate to those realities. Similarly, as someone in a polygamous relationship, you can't be a leader. And some would say that means an ordained leader. Others would say home group leader or anyone in kind of more prominent leadership in the church. You clergy and so on, these are issues that we're going to have to work out, because you're going to get a lovely couple arrive who say a lesbian couple who've adopted a lovely little boy who's disabled, and one of them becomes a Christian. And what do you tell them? And you're going to have to think it out. And it all sounds easy until you're in there, because you've got a disabled little boy and he calls her mum. And the other one, he calls her mum. So what are we going to do? And we need to be careful. But as we work through these things, we've been here before. We've been here in all kinds of ways, as I say, with polygamy. Let's hold true. Let's hold to the truth and say this is God's revelation. So that's just said just a little about the community that I think we need to nurture. But let's stop just there and just have a break for a minute if you want to stretch your legs, but don't walk around, because then people. And then we'll have a question time together, and you bring up all those thorny pastoral questions, and I'll ask Melvin to answer them.